Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexx here with another Master Duel video for you. So this was a video that I was pretty eager to make as soon as possible. Basically, I just wanted 2 weeks to pass from the last iteration of our meta-analysis before I moved on to our next one here. So just like the last one, in my quest to get as much objective data from only ranked ladder games in order to compile into a meta-analysis and breakdown, and then maybe a tier list even as a result, I only wanted to look at diamond rank decks from MasterDuelMeta.com. As we all know, Master Duel Meta is probably the best resource for gathering data about, well, decks played on Master Duel right now. However, the tier list that is represented on the site only shows the meta for the tournaments that are held, which are often best of 3. So in my quest to kind of figure out what is the ranked ladder, which for a lot of players is what, is a bit more pressing, as it's what we play either more often or exclusively as opposed to tournaments. In my kind of quest to see what that data looks like, I've basically compiled all of the decks that reached Diamond 5 or 1 from the time frame of October 28th to November 24th, and from there, we'll see what exactly that breakdown looks like. A couple of things to keep in mind before we jump into this are that, we're only pulling data from decks that people have actually submitted to Master Duel Meta, so I would have liked a whole lot more data if possible. Master Duel Meta as opposed to something like HS Replay for Hearthstone, which pulls data from millions of games in order to compile tier lists and breakdowns and all that stuff. There are only a few hundred decks that are submitted here to Master Duel Meta, which will represent thousands of games, but that's definitely not as many as millions. But all the same, it's the best resource we have, and I think still represents decently well what the meta is like. Now, also before we get into this real quick, I just want to plug real quick that earlier this week I started my Patreon page. There I post daily exclusive content to the page there, as well as previews of what's going to come up on the channel and other exclusive content there as well. So if you'd like to support the channel and want some, again, daily exclusive content, just like the YouTube channel, the Patreon page is updated every single day. Feel free to check that out. Link is going to be in the description. But yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and start taking a look at some of these statistics here. All right, so before we get into the breakdown of the last 2 weeks, let's take a look at the 2 weeks before that. This is something we already covered in our last video, our last meta-analysis video, but I just wanted to review the information we had seen there real quick. So, we are predictably seeing Branded Espia at the top. Floowandereeze did take us by surprise, take me personally by surprise, especially seeing that much representation over Sword Soul Tenyi, a solid, over 3% more. That really surprised me, although it is one of the highlights, I think, of showing best of 1 ranked ladder versus tournament meta ladder. Floowandereeze is one of those decks that does tend to perform better in a best of 1 format because of multiple factors, but mainly that it's harder for decks to prepare for Floowandereeze in a best of 1 format, both in terms of the tech that they would play against the deck, the cards like Max C would side out against the deck, and also just the fact that, sometimes Floowandereeze just goes first and they drop Impen plus Barrier Statue plus Streaming Town, and then you just kind of can't do anything and you have to concede. That just happens, in best of 1 format, which in best of 3 format you just go to game 2, but I digress. So that is where I think we saw a decent amount of Floowandereeze above Sword Souls. I would have expected to see Sword Souls in second. Branded Espia being at top is fairly expected. I also wasn't expecting Yuumi Control to be so represented, but again, a stun deck in a best of 1 format, players might not draw or even have back row removal in their main deck, so that does tend to give it a little bit more of an advantage. Well, I guess to be fair, the Kairyu Shen is the main floodgate there, which isn't a back row, but all the same, it's a similar concept as Floowandereeze, right? Where we're seeing a stun deck do well, mostly because it has the best of 1 factor kind of playing to its advantage in that regard. Marine Citizen Salamangreat did surprise me a little bit, not too much, but these 2 combo-based decks are very different, but still seeing fairly equal representation. I guess Salamangreat not falling off after the popularity of the structure deck kind of waned just waned. That's the word I'm looking for. That surprised me a bit. Salamangreat definitely performing better in Master Duel than I anticipated it would, which is, still fine, I think. Then, of course, we have Numron here being represented as well, because Numron is just going to be ever present, again, in a best-of-1 format. So, again, now this is just the breakdown from the last video. Just wanted to briefly review that before we jumped into the new breakdown from the last 2 weeks here, so that we can kind of compare and contrast, and then after that we'll combine them and talk a little bit more about the differences as well. So yeah, let's just go ahead and take a look at the most recent statistical breakdown of Diamond Drake decks, which is going to be this one right here. So we're seeing from November 10th to November 24th. These are the decks that have reached Diamond 5 or 1 in that time. And we're seeing Sword Soul actually have a massive jump from 3rd place up to 1st, even above Branded Despia, by a considerable amount, almost 2%. 11.6% of the decks that hit Diamond in the last 2 weeks were Sword Souls. Followed by Branded Despia at 9.5%. Then we're seeing a dramatic drop down to Flandre's at only 4.2%, as opposed to the 10.3% from the last graph there. Flandre's actually tied with Scareclaw and Endymion for 4.2% representation. Then after that we have Eldritch at 3.7%, Adamancipator at 3.7% as well, Live Twin at 3.2%, and then we have our 52% other category. So, Sword Soul seeing this much play is, or rather these many Diamond decks, is a little surprising, to be honest. I definitely wasn't anticipating that. I did, anticipate that it would be above Flandre's for this breakdown, likely because of the announcement on the 15th where we saw that Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds is going to get banned on the 30th, even though it's not banned just yet. I did anticipate that quite a few Flandre's players would kind of jump ship and maybe move towards different decks. I had speculated during the last meta-analysis that perhaps Eldritch not seeing as much play as anticipated was because those players had jumped ship to Flandre's. Now we're seeing Eldritch kind of creep back up in terms of representation. I can't help but wonder if that is, the opposite case now happening, but who knows. Either way, Sword Soul seeing so much play and just performing so well above Branded Despia these last couple of weeks. I think that might just be an instance of variance. That is a factor that I haven't talked too much about in terms of these breakdowns, right? Sometimes it's possible when looking at data like this that we're looking for trends that don't exist. So it's easy to see Sword Souls in the previous breakdown versus Sword Souls in this one and think, what is the difference, what changed, what happened? And it might not even necessarily be the case that anything changed, because I don't think that necessarily anything did. The only thing I could think of is that perhaps because Flandre's are seeing less play, Sword Soul is doing better, but even then, I kind of can't help but think that Sword Soul doesn't necessarily have a significantly worse matchup against Flandre's than something like Branded Despia, for example. So you would think if that were the case, we would see Branded Despia see an equally inflated number of results, but indeed we're actually seeing a deflated number of results, a decrease of representation in Branded Despia. So I think, honestly, this just kind of can be chalked up to just variance. And by variance, I mean just trends in the data that happen to be, I think it just happened to be that these 2 weeks we saw more Sword Souls in the last 2 weeks. Again, sometimes that can happen. There doesn't always have to be a reason for it. And that's why I wanted to also show data from the whole scope of it, right? As opposed to just 2 weeks at a time. In the next kind of graph we're going to look at, we're going to see a breakdown of decks from October 28th to November 24th. And I think that's going to give us a better idea of what the overall meta looks like. That is something I've talked about a little bit on the channel, something I do think is very much worth pointing out. And I think sometimes people tend to forget pretty easily is that just again, this idea that there doesn't always have to be a reason behind trends. It can just be variance, and it's okay for that to be the reason. We don't have to always create one necessarily. As far as others kind of just factors that are playing into this graph here, Scareclaw is seeing a fair bit more play than I thought it would, a fair bit more representation. However, I do think that is also due to it kind of being one of the new decks on the block. I'm not saying it's a bad deck by any means, but I would be decently surprised if Scareclaw continued to see this much representation kind of moving forward in like the next meta analysis, for example. Endymion kind of popping up is pretty random too. Endymion saw, just for whatever, one reason or another, a pretty huge increase in play these last 2 weeks as opposed to the 2 weeks before that. Same with Live Twin, actually. Live Twin, I think, only had one or two decks represented in the last breakdown, whereas this one had closer to 6 or 7, I believe. It was 6. So yeah, that was, again, but I think that's just also due to variance. I don't think Live Twin suddenly got better, or like Endymion suddenly got better. I will chalk that up mostly to variance. If you have any theories about that, do let me know in the comments below. I'm always interested to hear what you all have to say about these kind of breakdowns as well. Because you often, offer insights that I might not have. So yeah, we'll definitely love to hear from you and what you think about that. If you agree that maybe it's just variance, or if you think there might be another reason why we're seeing more decks like Endymion and Live Twin and Sword Soul and less like Branded Despia and Flaunderies and stuff. But alright, so this data, like I said, is nice, but I think for a better overall idea of what this current meta looks like, we should take the data from the past 2 weeks, the data from the 2 weeks before that, and combine them so that way we get a full idea of how things have changed in the last month overall since the ban list dropped on the 28th of October. So let's go straight into that. Okay, so here we have the breakdown that I think a lot of people have been really looking for, and one that I find to be most valuable among all of the breakdowns and graphs in this video thus far, and that's going to be this one here, showing all decks that have hit Diamond rank, either Diamond 5 or Diamond 1, from October 28th to November 24th here. So this, I think, is a little bit more in line with what I was expecting to see as far as like decks in like a tiered order. And I am thinking about making like a tier list video where we do make an actual tier list based on this data here, as opposed to normally we make more speculative tier lists. But now that we have actual data to go off of, I'm thinking about doing it that way. So if that's a video you'd be interested in seeing, definitely let me know in the comments below. And I can definitely get started on that ASAP. But in any case here, yeah, so now we're seeing among all decks that have hit Diamond in about a month here, Branded Despia has 11% of that representation. That's followed by Sword Souls at 9.6%. After that are Flaunderies at 7%. Marine Sis actually comes after that at 3.5%. Then Dragonlink, Eldritch, and Adamancipator each having 3.2% representation. Following that, we have Salamandrates and Spirals at 2.9%, and then our other category consisting of the remaining 53.5% of decks. So yeah, this is, again, like I said, a little bit more what I was expecting here. Branded Despia at the top, with Sword Souls actually not too far behind, only 1.4% below, but those standing a decent bit above Flaunderies, which are at 7%. So those have kind of been historically, since Branded Despia entered the scene, those have kind of been the like top 3 sort of meta decks for a little while now, that would being Branded Despia, Sword Souls, and Flaunderies. And I think this is a good kind of graph to show just how much of an impact they've had on the meta, not just over this last month, but I think over like the month before that as well. I think if you were to look at these numbers, they'd be relatively similar, I think, for at least these top 3 decks here. And I think these are relatively healthy numbers here as far as like representation goes. When the other category is above 50%, I think that's a pretty good sign. I think that's a sign of a fairly diverse meta. And I think the top deck only holding 11% by itself is fine. Now, if you want to argue that Sword Soul is also tier 1, then you could say that, Despia and Sword Soul between them have 20%. But I think, tier 1 as a whole making up 20% of the overall ladder, that sounds about right. It's definitely a lot more healthy than, the 70+% we're seeing of tier laments in the TCG right now. And I think OCG as well still. Actually, I know OCG as well still. So, yeah, we have that to, I guess, look forward to in the future. It's funny, I actually made a tweet about this because I've seen this statement made on, like, the subreddit and, like, the Discord and occasionally in the comment section as well. This idea, like, that, you know, it's decks like Despia and Sword Soul that are really keeping the meta down right now. But, you know, we're seeing pretty objectively here that that's actually not the case. There's a great diversity in what's being represented and even what's not in, you know, what's in the other category. We're still seeing a lot of diversity, and when I see the argument aimed at Sword Souls in particular, I'm especially confused. I think Sword Souls are a very fair deck as far as tier 1 decks go. They're a lot like Tri Brigade when Tri Brigade was like the top tier 1 deck. It's funny, I've talked about this before too. When people talk about that first meta, they call it the Drytron meta. Even though Tri Brigade was Tri Brigade Zodiac in particular was the best deck. It was better, higher tiered, more, you know, saw more play and more power than Drytrons. But people call it Drytrons because people remember that as like the toxic deck of the format. And I think people tend to not just in terms of like Master Duel or even games, but I think kind of in life in general, remember more negative things than like positive things. So like when the tiered decks are, you know, in my opinion, not that bad, like Sword Soul Tinny and Tri Brigade, I think people will either blow them up to make them be that bad in the case of Sword Souls, or move on to the next most toxic deck and complain about that, like Drytrons. So, and I think that kind of happens with Flaunderies a bit, although Flaunderies, I mean, they are fairly annoying to play against, so I'm not like as, you know, I guess Drytrons, to be fair, are pretty annoying to play against as well. In any case, my main point is, I don't think the meta we're in is that bad at all. I think we're in a very healthy meta. I think this is what most metas want to look like. And I think we're about to enter a meta that's, I think, maybe a little more worth complaining about. I guess is the only comment I was going to make about that. But yeah, as far as the top 3 decks, you know, that's fairly expected. Marine Sis being under that as at 3.5%, above Dragon Link in particular. I guess I'm a little surprised. Like, I mean, you know, from the last meta-analysis we did, I knew that, okay, Marine Sis is definitely better than I thought it was, but it's actually continuing to be represented here and continuing to have a pretty good standing. So Marine Sis actually a very solid deck. Like, I'd probably be willing to call it a solid tier 3, maybe even lower tier 2 deck. Again, I'd still have to figure out how I'd want to break down the tiers there. Because Dragon Link, I would consider that a tier 2 deck, but Marine Sis is seeing even more Diamond decks, or rather decks in Diamond than Dragon Link is right now. So, no, I think that's pretty surprising, but pretty cool at the same time. Eldritch we're seeing finally represented. I say finally as if I've wanted Eldritch to, to see more representation. I guess I was just a bit more surprised that it, you know, ended up being shuffled into the other category during the last breakdown. It's definitely one that I would consider like a deck that bounces between tier 2 and tier 3 pretty consistently. I think Eldritch is a pretty solid tier 3 deck at the moment. Adamantipator, I think we're seeing that mostly because of the Anti-Spell Festival, but I think that also goes to show that sometimes these decks that we might think are like, oh, dead. Like, I think a lot of people would have considered Adamantipator dead before the Anti-Spell Festival, but I think the festival did serve to remind people that the deck is still more than viable. It's actually just good, so. And then Salamandrates we saw, you know, before as well. Spirals I want to talk about a little bit. Spirals we're seeing represented here. And this might be surprising because you might think, well, we didn't see Spirals on either of the last lists, but it's suddenly on this one. And yeah, actually, Spirals saw consistent play throughout the last month. Not enough during each individual 2-week period to make the you know, the graph here to be represented, but when you combine the previous 2 weeks, and this is another reason why I wanted to do this, then Spiral has enough combined decks being represented to show up on this list. So that's another reason to look at data from the last month overall as opposed to only looking at it in 2-week intervals, is to show decks like Spiral that might not have enough individual representation over 2 weeks, but over the course of a month have built up enough decks to be represented here on the graph here. So this is what I would consider to be, you know, kind of a good idea of what we're seeing on the ranked ladder. At least in my experience, this, you know, these numbers seem to line up, and I think that will mostly prove to be the case overall as well. Again, as always, as ever, let me know in the comments what you think of this breakdown. If you think it's accurate, if it's what in line with what you've been seeing, or even if you disagree and think that there are decks that should be represented here that are not, definitely let me know. But I did notice a few like interesting data trends, notable data trends. Let's take a look at those here real quick. Yeah, so these are just a few notes from, comparing the last 2 weeks to the 2 weeks from before, and just things I noticed here. So, as far as decks from the new Battle Trajectory pack that introduced this season, we're seeing that Scareclaw is by far the most represented of those decks. They had a total of 8 decks that reached Diamond on Master Duel Meta over the last month. Well, 2 weeks, since the pack's only been out for so long. Valence, by comparison, only had the 1, and Odd Eyes, which also got some new support, had 0. So it doesn't look like that Odd Eyes support, particularly that Zark support. Well, I guess there was the Odd Eyes Ritual Monster too, and the a few just Pendulum monsters, but wasn't enough to push Odd Eyes into kind of any amount of representation. Valence also not as great, apparently, as Scareclaw's here. Scareclaw having this many decks being represented did surprise me a little bit. Again, I don't know that I would expect that moving forward. I think it's because it's a newer deck that it's seeing as much play as it is, but I'm always open to the idea of being wrong. This is in particular Scareclaw as opposed to the Tri-Brigade variant, which I did count separately. I believe only had 1, maybe 2 decks being represented that hit Diamond in the last month or so. Let's see, the other thing that I noticed was Yuumi control, and I wanted to touch on this a little bit earlier when we looked at the October 28th to November 9th breakdown, but I wanted to save it because I knew I was going to bring it up here in the data trends. Yuumi control has fallen off considerably. It had 8 decks represented from the 28th of October to November 9th, but only had 1 deck that hit Diamond in the last 2 weeks from the 10th to the 24th there. I did touch on this a little bit already. On the other hand, we saw Endymion had like literally the opposite trend happen, where they only had 1 deck from the 28th to the 9th, but then from the 10th to the 24th, they had 8 decks all of a sudden. So I don't think that's like, I'm not making a direct comparison there. I'm not saying, oh, everyone who was playing Yuumi Control now is playing Endymion instead. I just thought that was interesting that they had like kind of the opposite, the complete opposite trends there as far as number of decks that were hitting Diamond with them. As far as like why Yuumi Control is falling off, I think it could be due to it like, previously when we saw it was still kind of like one of the newer decks on the block, but now there are other new decks around, and maybe some of the people who like to jump from, new release to new release had jumped from Yuumi Control to like Scareclaw / Valence. That could very well be a thing. It could also just be like a coincidence. Like I mentioned earlier, it is possible that there just happened to have been less Yuumi Control decks in the last 2 weeks than the 2 weeks before. I don't know that we're going to see it being represented again like it was before, again just due to its popularity dwindling over time, but I do still think it's a solid, at the very least, like upper rogue, if not like lower tier 3 deck. I do think Yuumi Control is still fairly good. Speaking of trends, again, like I was just talking about before, Adamantipator did see quite a bit more play in Season 11 due to compared to previous seasons, likely due to its popularity in the Anti-Spell Festival, which again, like I was saying, really goes to show that sometimes it just takes like a moment, like a spark of popularity for people to realize like, oh, this deck is still really good. It's actually what I've been talking about a lot with Adventure Phantom Knights this season. How I think a lot of people kind of think the deck is worse than it actually is, or maybe just aren't even thinking about the deck at all, because in their minds, maybe even subconsciously, they're thinking, well, Celestial got banned, Fusion Destiny went to 1, and Water Enchantress went to 1, so a deck that uses both Adventure and DPE engines is not going to be good anymore. But that's just not the case. I think Adventure Phantom Knights is definitely underrepresented, and possibly for the same reason that Adamantipator we're seeing was underrepresented, and we are seeing that it was underrepresented in all those seasons past because of how many people are hitting Diamond with it now. I think that it's just a matter. I've talked about this a lot before when talking about meta decks in general. It's all about power and representation. A deck's power level in a vacuum can solely make up its spot on a tier list, but in reality, we have to also consider representation, as how often people are playing a deck is going to be oftentimes more of a factor than power level, as we're seeing again with Adamantipator, and I suspect other decks like Adventure Phantom Knight. And then finally, the only other thing I wanted to point out was just something that I think everybody could have saw coming, is that Flandres predictably saw a drop in representation following the ban list announcement on November 15th, which announced the banning of Barrier Statue of the Stormwind. So again, even though Barrier Statue of the Stormwind is not going to be banned until the 30th, after a little under a week, we are still seeing people kind of jump the Flandres ship, and just it seeing less representation overall. Again, representation versus power level, because power level wise nothing has changed about Flandres, but people's perception of the deck, and in turn its representation has very much changed. So alright, now just like last time, because I'm sure a lot of you are curious, I wanted to show a list of a lot of the decks, not all, but a lot of the decks that made up that other category, because I know when I'm seeing breakdowns like this, I'm always wondering what is in that other category. So let's take a look real quick at what is in that. And here we have here, again, this is not all of the decks that make up that other category, but a good deal of them. I decided to include a few more decks that were featured like more in the last 2 weeks as opposed to the two from before that. But just like last time, they're kind of represented in like, you know, appears the most to appears the least in the other category. So saw a lot of Pendulum Magician and Madolches between the two breakdowns over the last month overall. Pendulum Magician in particular falling like just short of enough representation to actually make the tier list. Madolches too, actually, now that I think about it. Both decks are just like one or two decks off from being able to make it on that pie chart there. We're seeing more Orcus as well. That's not that much of a surprise given that Heartpourer went to 2, not very recently, but relatively recently. But also the announcement that Galatea is going to 2. I think a lot of people are gearing up for that change and practicing with their Orcus deck. So I wasn't surprised to see some more of those here as well. Again, just kind of the opposite example from Flandres of how representation can matter. Again, even though the power level of Orcus hasn't changed, the representation has gone up due to people's perception of it changing. Drytron, Sky Striker, Ada Axis Blind Second, and Numeron were all also very close to being able to, or very close to having enough decks to be able to be represented on the pie chart there. Numeron, it was another deck that actually saw a pretty sharp drop in representation. That actually didn't surprise me too much though, because a lot of the Numeron decks that we did see represented from October 28th to November 9th did come during those last 3 days of Season 10, which again makes a lot of sense to me. As people are more desperate to hit Diamond or Diamond 1 before the season ends as it gets closer, I think they'll turn to a deck like Numeron, which has a fairly quick turnover rate as far as games played, as in the games are very short. Regardless of if you win or lose, Numeron games tend to end relatively quickly. So I think that's why a lot of people tend to gravitate towards it at the end of a season. Adventure Phantom Knights, yet again, falling under the other category, which for me technically would be like the rogue category, but again, I still think they're like upper tier 3, if not lower tier 2. But, you know, that's an argument I've made a lot this season, so I'll just kind of put a nix on that there. But yeah, you know, we've got Heroes. Infernoids saw a couple of decks these past couple of weeks. Dark Magician saw more representation from the 20th to the 9th as opposed to the last 2 weeks, but it was still there. Tri-Brigade Lyrilusc. Altergeist and Traptrick saw a small spike in popularity, I think also due to their play in the Anti-Spell Festival. Cyber Dragon, even decks like Final Countdown and Chainburn, as annoying as they are, can't hit Diamond, not Diamond 1, I think they both hit Diamond 5, but still, can't hit Diamond. Thunder Dragon, Nordics saw a couple of Nordic decks. Sun Avalon, Magical Musketeers, Mermails, wow, Mermails, what is this, like 2013? It's pretty awesome. Code Talkers, did see some braided Tri-Brigades this time around, which is nice. B-Troopers, Valence, and Magispectors. So these are all decks that I like to show this other category off, not just to satisfy people's curiosity like I tend to be curious, but also just to show that, you know, you really can hit Diamond with a deck as long as you're dedicated enough with it. I see that comment a lot. Like, can I hit Diamond with this deck? Is this deck capable of hitting Diamond? Am I able to make it Diamond 1 with this deck? The answer generally is, if you devote enough time to the deck and or are a good enough pilot with the deck, yes, like you can hit Diamond with just about anything. but it is going to be a matter of dedication above all else. If you're using a deck that I wouldn't consider to be tiered, decks that are represented on like the graphs that I showed. But again, these decks are all capable of hitting Diamond 5 or 1, which means that, I think if a lot of these decks are capable of doing it, then whatever deck you're thinking of is probably capable of doing it as well. Alright, I think that's about all the time that I've got for today, so thank you for watching all the way to the very end of the video. I very much greatly appreciate it, especially these videos, these meta-analysis videos. I really like doing them. I like looking at this data. I think it's fairly interesting, and I think it's nice to be able to say, like, again, this is what the ranked ladder meta specifically looks like, as opposed to also including tournament data. Again, want to remind you all that I did launch that Patreon earlier this week, so if you'd like to see some daily exclusive content over there, feel free to follow the link in the description below and check that out. I would very much appreciate the support if you choose to provide it. If not, totally fine. The support that you give just by watching up to this point, or commenting or subscribing, it all means a lot to me, and none of it means more than the other necessarily. So just know that your support in all of its forms is very much appreciated. But I think that's about all the time that I've got for today's video. So without further ado, this is Hexlex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.